South Korea says it is unable to pay $350 billion upfront to the US under a tariff deal proposed by Donald Trump. The country is now looking for an alternative.
Now, trade deal between the United States and South Korea is in a flux following Donald Trump's demand for a $350 billion upfront investment.
South Korea's president warning of potentially devastating effects tied to the country's trade deal with the U.S. Speaking with Reuters, the Korean president saying his country's economy could fall into crisis like the one it faced in 1997.
Factories were expected to surge back to life. Cities were poised to flourish once more. Foreign capital was supposed to flood into the United States. That was the vision behind Trump's tariffs. A daring plan to ignite a new industrial era. But the reality is far less inspiring. In July, Washington and Seoul unveiled a framework that could have funneled $350 billion in South Korean investment into the U.S. economy, tied to easing specific tariffs. Months later, that commitment remains largely unfulfilled. Little more than ink on a page. South Korea isn't alone in its caution. Across Europe and Asia, bold investment promises are stalled, with few signs of turning into real factories, jobs, or wages. The uncertainty grew sharper after a jarring raid in Georgia, where foreign workers were detained in a move that left investors wondering if America remains the reliable partner it once claimed to be. If trust keeps eroding, who will risk betting on America's future? How long can Washington cling to the mirage of a revival? In South Korea, the sting of the Georgia incident lingers. Earlier this September, hundreds of engineers and technicians from Hyundai and LG arrived in the U.S. to help launch one of the nation's largest battery projects. Instead of being celebrated for their role in building a cutting-edge facility, they were abruptly rounded up in an immigration raid. Over 300 workers were sent back to Seoul on a plane, escorted without charges or clear explanations, carrying the bitter memory of being treated like criminals. Families watching their return called it humiliating. Executives at both companies saw a red flag, questioning whether their billions in investments were truly welcome. The timing was disastrous. Just weeks prior, Washington and Seoul had announced a deal that could have reshaped economic ties for years. The plan was straightforward. The U.S. would cap tariffs on Korean goods at 15%, and in return, South Korea would pour $350 billion into American industries. It was meant to be a defining moment, a symbol of mutual trust and ambition. But by the time those engineers were deported, the deal had stalled. South Korea's president made it clear that such a massive capital outflow couldn't proceed without financial safeguards. Without a currency swap to protect Seoul from sudden economic shocks, the funds could push Korea's economy toward a crisis reminiscent of 1997. Until those protections are secured, the money stays put. The Georgia raid turned caution into alarm. What was meant to be a story of opportunity became a lesson in risk. South Korea isn't alone. Europe, too, is caught between Washington's promises and the challenge of delivering capital. In September, U.S. and European leaders announced a sweeping deal. Tariffs capped at 15% alongside pledges of $600 billion in European investment by decade's end. On paper, it seemed ambitious and historic. In reality, the details are murky. Who will fund it? Which governments or companies will step up? When will projects actually break ground? These questions remain unanswered. Across Europe, public sentiment is skeptical. With inflation still high and many nations grappling with their own budget pressures, citizens are asking why their capital should flow abroad while their own economies struggle. Without clarity and political resolve, the so-called breakthrough feels more like a headline than a turning point. Canada's approach stands in sharp contrast. Unlike Europe and South Korea, Ottawa has avoided making grandiose promises with Washington. Instead, it's focusing inward, channeling resources into critical minerals, new pipelines, port expansions, and housing. These efforts signal stability and foresight. For global investors eyeing North America, the difference is stark. While U.S. policies sow turbulence and doubt, Canada presents itself as a steady, secure destination for capital. It's steering clear of bold pledges that might crumble under scrutiny. building trust through tangible projects already in motion. This contrast underscores a broader trend. The tariff strategy, meant to restore American strength, is backfiring. Promises of hundreds of billions in future investments sound impressive, but the follow-through is lacking. What was supposed to reassure American workers has instead left allies skeptical. By mid-2025, independent studies confirmed the toll. Reciprocal tariffs slowed U.S. growth, stoked inflation,